Good afternoon and welcome to Fortress Press Live, where we connect you with the people and passions behind the books we publish here at Fortress Press. During the 2014 American Academy of Religion and Society of Biblical Literature Conference in San Diego, we brought together Dr. Jerry Sumney and a group of professors to discuss teaching Introduction to the Bible. Their full discussion follows in its entirety.
Well, thank you all for being here and for being interested in thinking a little more about teaching the Bible. I know it's new to some of you. Some of you, both Testaments together, some of you just the Bible as a whole. What I'd like to do is to start a little bit just by talking about our audience, by talking about our students, and see if those students sound like the same ones that I'm familiar with. And then maybe think together about some ways that we can address them that I hope helps them to engage the material in ways that we want them to get it, and for different purposes that we want them to get the material in different contexts. I recently read a teacher in an undergraduate setting who said this: Generally, instructors of biblical studies in the liberal arts context assume ignorance among their students in their courses, and we're rarely disappointed. I think that's right. For the most part, our students come with very little or no knowledge of the Bible. One of the first semesters that I was teaching undergraduate intro, it was an introduction to the New Testament course. I had a couple young women in about the second or third week come by and say, "We are just lost, and we can't figure out what's going on." And I had thought I'd explained everything. I thought I'd used the, non-technical vocabulary. They were all coming on, and I said, so just what is it that's causing you trouble? And they said, well, you keep mentioning these people, like Moses and David. Like, who are those people? I mean, and they had no information about anything that went on in the Bible. So they started with just nothing. But in the same classroom, we also have students who know something about the content of the Bible and who come with some very set ideas about it, often naive ideas, but ones they're pretty confident about. So when they come to us, even those who are uninformed don't come as a tabula rasa. They come if they know anything, and they usually know at least this, some false information. They've usually heard things about it that are incorrect, or they've read Dan Brown, and think that must be the way things are. And so nobody comes with just nothing. And we have in the same classroom students who want to know why they have to take a Bible course, right? Those who are just not sure it's an important topic at all. And so one of the first tasks I think we have is to figure out how to let them know that it is in fact something important to study, whether it's in the context of a church-related school or a liberal arts college or a state university. One of the ways that I used to deal with that regularly was to, in the second class period or so, to show the first hour of the film series or the PBS series, Eyes on the Prize, that record of the civil rights movement. It's a great introduction to how influential the Bible is, because you've got the African Americans meeting in church using Bible language, and there are scenes of the Klan people in their parade with crosses on the top of their cars. And it's clear that how these people are reading the Bible is influencing the way that they act as citizens. And so I think being careful about making sure students see a reason.
Sorry, could you say again which episode?
The very first one. A few months ago, I was asked by the Patheos website, if you all know it a little bit, to write something on why anybody should bother to read the Bible. And so I brought copies of what I had to say to them because it's a fairly broad audience if you all want to look at that. And I just mentioned some ways that the Bible impacts our culture, the way it impacts political decisions, the way that it has especially impacted literature everywhere from Moby Dick to now we have a whole series of popular movies, Noah, the Exodus, all sorts of things are coming out. And of course, every Easter we get the 10 Commandments coming on TV. So they get information like that out there. It's influencing. And even if you want to be able to watch The Last Temptation of Christ or The Life of Brian, it's out there making a difference in the way that students perceive things. And an introduction to what's really in the Bible and how we read it is important if they want to sort of be protected against the kind of superstitious things that pretends to be scholarship on the History Channel. If only we could get that eerie music behind us in our classrooms, I think we'd be much more effective.
We'd have more authority.
That's right. So, in a sense, I think we can present reading the Bible to those who are skeptical and not in any way using it as something for themselves, for them to see it as self-defense. So that if they don't know how people are using the Bible, they won't really be able to understand some of the discussions and some of the places where the people are coming from. So they need a way to sort of participate essentially in civic debate that has some knowledge of what the Bible is and what it does, because they're going to be debating with people who do take the Bible as sort of the authority for the way that we have to do things. Now, I think some folks here are from a seminary too, is that right? We have? Yeah. As I teach in a seminary, I have to say, unfortunately, that they know just as little about the Bible as undergraduate students do. Okay, my students come often having had some, relatively recent movement to be a part of the church, so they didn't grow up knowing the Bible. The ones that did often attended churches that didn't give much attention to the Bible, or they come from places where the Bible was not used very well. And so they don't come with much more than our undergraduates, except for a commitment to their religious beliefs, but they really don't know how the Bible does or does not inform those. And so as I thought about the intro book here, I thought that sort of the thing that students really need is to move them from sort of having almost no knowledge to having some substantive understanding. So that it has to start out at a very basic level, but it has to move them quickly to something moderately sophisticated. That is, I don't want them just to know some data when we get done, but I want them to begin to develop ways of understanding, sort of lenses for finding the meaning there themselves. So we have to move them there in a sense without a lot of the supporting argument that we know exists and without a lot of the technical vocabulary that makes it easy to do, but we still want them to have access to those kinds of understanding. So I'm hopeful that that's the kind of thing that we can do even in rushed introductions to the Bible. So do those students sound like the ones you all have? Yeah. Well, as I think about teaching these folks, since they are largely ignorant of the text, they don't know the basic stories that are in the Bible, and they need that sort of background. I think it's Kierkegaard who said that while history has to be lived forward, it can only be understood backward. So that one of the things that I think it's important for us to do is to help students understand that these texts are looking backwards. Okay? That they're trying to find ways to understand what has happened. They're trying to find ways to think through the circumstances in which they find themselves. And as our students, those who do know something about the stories of the Bible, I think they almost always know them really badly. The Sunday school version is almost never a version that helps them understand the text broadly. And I think of the way that I think most Sunday schools talk about the story of Israel and, being unfaithful and being punished by God. And we look at those and go, man, God was really mean. Where, of course, if you read the whole book, or if you step back and read the whole Deuteronomistic history, the point is God is patient. And so they just have the opposite perspective of what the text really wants to give you, because they don't know the whole story. So I think one of the things that it's important to offer is that overarching tale so that you can fit the individual pieces into it. So extracting individual episodes almost always gets the wrong meaning. And so I hope that one of the things that happens in an intro to Bible is that you're forced to, sort of those broad things, but that it really does benefit them by giving them, in a sense, what the authors wanted them to hear, or that longer tale. As I think about the kinds of things that students need, and one of the reasons that the textbook is structured as it is that I think they need some of that prolegomena. And so the first chapters, of course, of my intro are things on how the canon came together, on textual criticism and translation, and on meanings of inspiration. And I think those are lacking in a number of textbooks that introduce the Bible. So again, if any students know anything about canon development, they're sure Constantine and a bunch of guys in a smoke-filled back room came up with the Bible. Or if they think about inspiration, the only thing they know is some people say God wrote every word of it. Or if they know anything, well, they don't know anything about translation. So we could tell them how the text got to us and the reason translations are different. It begins to help them have, again, some broader basis to think about what's going on in the text. And I think there are almost no introductions to the Bible that have a chapter on inspiration that just tells sort of the history of how we got to the debate that we have now. And of course, that's one of the things that students, whether they think the Bible is important or not, they all know about that debate. They all want to talk about it. So I hope that those things help us sort of set up the reading of the text in a way that's helpful. Talking about those issues doesn't demand that the student take a particular perspective, but they ought to know how things got to the place where they are now, I think. And then I think that the most helpful perspective to lead students through to begin with is to adopt, sort of broadly construed, the historical critical method. Now, I think it's important for them to know about other readings, and in fact, one of the changes to the second edition of the book was to add an appendix on alternative readings, so advocacy readings and different sorts of readings, so that students know those kinds of things are there. But those who do those kinds of criticisms the best already know the results of historical critical reading. So that the starting point is really coming to understand the text the best that we can. And when I talk about historical criticism broadly conceived, I mean, I don't limit that to just sort of where it happened and what the circumstances were of the writers, but include sort of narrative criticism at times. It includes certainly kinds of rhetorical criticism where we look at the way they present their argumentation, look at literary critical matters. So all that I include kind of under the broad umbrella of historical critical reading. One of the other things I think it's important to do is to, in our teaching, just acknowledge that the Bible is a religious book. I mean, oftentimes when we go to teach it, it gets taught as literature, it gets taught as history, and, well, it's a religious book. So if we're going to get to what it's about, we're going to have to talk about religious ideas. And so as I use the historical critical sort of way of approach, it's to get to that sort of religious meaning. Doesn't mean that students have to think that's something they need to live by or think with, but they at least need to get to what kind of a text this is. And I think it really helps them to read when we start to distinguish it from other kinds of texts. So talking about how this is not political history, it's not social history, it's not objective history, it's a religious interpretation of events. It wants to get to sort of the meaning of this event rather than tell you, here's what happened. And one of the places that I do some of that is, again, with the Deuteronomistic history, where you can just go through and the writers will tell you this story and sort of put it in, the theological framework they want it to be in, and then they'll say, and if you want to know more about this, you can go read about it in the book of Jeshar or in the book of the Kings, the Chronicles of the Kings. So there are other places you could get data. They want to give you interpretation. If we can get our students to see that that's what's going on here, then I think it helps them begin to read the text in a very different sort of way. If we can get them to see that you have people writing a lot of these texts from exile and going, how did we get here? Just trying to figure out that they're trying to give an interpretation not only to what went on, but to where they are, so that they're seeking ways of finding the meaning of their national history, of the place they are individually. So just sort of helping students recognize that this is a genre that's distinct from all those other kinds of things, I think is a really good step in moving us toward helping them read the Bible more carefully and get to what's there. Recognizing that the Bible is a religious book is why I think it's important that we start off talking about those matters of prolegomena, because we only talk about those because people take this to be a religious book. And if you look at introductions to other religions, often you'll get those kinds of discussions about how the canon of Confucianism came together. And we don't bother to do that often for Bible. But if we take seriously the kind of text it is, we have to take seriously the kinds of questions that it raises, I think. I think one of the other things that it's in some ways hard to do is, while we're in sort of those broad classrooms, is recognizing what's at stake for some students when we begin to introduce new ideas, and how it is that we help those that have a lot at stake to be open to new kinds of ideas. I think sometimes the vocabulary that we know and have gotten used to is very frightening. And it sort of sends them scurrying away and won't let them hear what it is they need to if they're going to understand the text as I think it was intended to be understood. So, for example, one of the things that I do in Genesis, so when I get to the first few chapters of Genesis, I don't say, this is a myth. It is, but instead of that, I talk about it as a poetic narrative. Now, that's not a threatening thing to say about it. Now, in a text box, I get around to going, by the way, the technical name for a poetic narrative is a myth. But by then, it's not so scary because they've learned to sort of, they can think in those other categories if we don't spring things on them that are immediately threatening. And so I think it's important, and throughout the book, I try to sort of ease students toward seeing things in a new way and don't just kind of spring them on them in ways that frighten them. As I've already mentioned, I think one of the really important tasks is to try to get students to see these whole narratives. And part of it is not just to understand what's going on in the text as clearly as we might, but also those other kinds of readings where you just extract a piece have led to all kinds of things that most of us would find pretty offensive, right? Lots of folks find anti-Semitic things when they read those stories about how unfaithful the Israelites have been. We have lots of people who go, well, there must just be a different God in the Hebrew Bible than the New Testament because the God of Jesus is just real nice, and that other God, and of course it's because we haven't read the whole narrative. So I think it helps us avoid those who are taking the text seriously, and even those who are just reading it casually get the wrong ideas about the kind of religious thought these texts intend to give you. I think in some ways it's hard for us to talk about some of these texts, especially again texts like Joshua and Judges, where the Lord says go kill all the people and their dogs and their cats and everything else that's around there. So get rid of those. Well, in our time, when we're constantly talking about terrorism and things, we know that those kinds of texts in religious traditions, even in ours, get used to advocate some pretty horrible things. So I think part of the benefit of reading the larger narrative is to be able to set those kinds of stories, especially if we can say, listen, these are people who are trying to figure out how they might have been faithful. And, as most would say, they didn't really do those things. But they think it's a good idea, so that might be even worse. So we have to acknowledge that those are terrible things, but at the same time, figure out how the bad way that they want to accomplish something doesn't blind us to the purpose they're pointing toward. Now, we might want to argue about some of the purposes too, but we at least have to give them the courtesy as good readers of looking to why in the world they would think that was a good idea, and what in their world might set them in a place that they can look back a few hundred years ago and said, if we had just killed all those people, it would have been better. So I think we help our students if we can, again, sort of give them that perspective of acknowledging these are things that are unacceptable to do, while they say that, here's what they were trying to do. So let's think about whether what they were trying to do by those egregious things is something we can recognize as a value, and whether we accept it or not, at least see what was going on as they talked about those things. I hope as we sort of talked to this point about sort of students and teaching that it sounds like the kind of introduction to the Bible that I've been talking about is appropriate for both religious and non-religious institutions. I think teachers in each setting can do a lot of things that sort of situate their own courses in those places. But as I tried to write this textbook, I hope that it's usable in both of those settings. That what it does is present you with what the texts say, but not require, sort of confession. You might not want to think that, or you might not want to do that, but we would at least want to know what's actually in the text. So I hope that it leaves room, since for both believers and non-believers, and doesn't assume that you have to be either one of those in order to understand these texts. I think our task, going back to one of the first things that I said, is one of bringing our students who have little or no knowledge to positions of significant understanding. So it's not just about accumulating knowledge of what's in the Bible, but bringing them ways of understanding new kinds of literature so that they get some different ways of thinking, they get some different understandings of what's going on in these texts, and even get some practices at new kinds of reading. All right, let me stop there for just a moment and see what kind of thoughts you all have. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm from Siena College, Albany, New York area, and I picked your text after looking because I saw all these principles at work, and so I'm glad to see that they are very intentional. I have Catholic students, I have Muslim students, I have students who tell me they're atheists, and I think they all can use this book beneficially. And like you said, the hardest students I have to deal with are sort of Orthodox students. I have Greek and Egyptian Orthodox, and it's very hard to get them to think critically. They go back to what their priests are telling them, and sort of like you said, Sunday school material, and no matter, I give them an essay, and then I mark it down and tell them, if you come back and rewrite it, I'll mark it up. And that's the way I'm able to do the teaching, because otherwise they don't get it.
Mm-hmm.
They just can't fathom what we're talking about.
It really is hard, I think, to shift a framework. And here's a framework that's important for them. I bet we all, if we grew up in religious environments, think back to how hard that first shift was, and it wasn't a happy day, was it? Sometimes it was. It can be a very liberating thing, but it also, you're giving something up when you adopt that different perspective. Other folks, yes?
Yeah. So the context in which I teach Intro Bible is as one module in basically an introduction to world religions and philosophy.
Mm-hmm.
And so you get maybe 3 or 4 weeks, which is even more compressed.
Yes, it is.
4 weeks from the Bible.
No, it's excerpted stories.
Okay.
You get Abraham, Joseph, Ruth is optional. I always do it, and then the Gospel of Luke, and so absolutely everything you've named comes up in those 3 or 4 weeks, with very little time to address it effectively,
Mm-hmm.
and also help people just absorb the content. So I guess my question would be, how do you sort of titrate, here's the context you need to be able to get to this at all, and the actually getting to it, right?
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I wonder if, well, I think, first of all, there's one advantage to doing is that it's all in the context of other religious texts. So that they immediately ought to be thinking, though I bet they don't nearly as much, think about this as a text that's about religion rather than about science or history or whatever else. But I wonder if somehow setting the larger framework of the story in a few lectures that, and essentially, I mean, as I think about sort of reading the text of the Hebrew Bible, I mean, I just start with the exile, and say that's the place you have to interpret everything from. I mean, there wasn't much of the Hebrew Bible before the exile, and so if you want to interpret our origins, if you want to interpret where our king came from, all those kind of things are always being viewed from, how the heck did we get here? I mean, we thought we had this God who was going to do all these things for us, and we end up a displaced people. So how do we understand those stories? How do we tell those stories so that they actually end up getting us here and we don't have to give up God?
And given that the exile is never named in any of the texts I teach,
Yes.
it becomes
Right.
my job to introduce the whole concept.
It does, that's right. But in a way, I mean, it's in some ways just saying, sort of the basic expectation from Abraham forward is we're going to be a great nation. And they thought they had a good start on that, and suddenly the rug is jerked out from under them, after a few hundred years, and so they've got to figure out what went wrong. So, but it is, that's a pretty difficult task. Anybody else have any wisdom for that?
I was just thinking that we really are pushing against the grain. Our millennial students who are coming in and they're so used to a visual culture, and we're trying to get them into a flat, two-dimensional text. Now, it's never flat. There's all this background, there's all this interweaving of ideas and concepts. So whether it's 3 weeks you've got or 3 months, it's still not enough time. How do you invite the students into the experience of this fabulous, literature? That's what I struggle with. How do I take what I've read and show them what there is for them? Kind of what you do in this one paper. Why read the Bible at all?
Well, I think one of the things that millennials are interested in is story. They're interested in narrative, and fortunately, tons of the Bible is narrative. So I mean, they're not used to narratives quite this long, but they are used to thinking that stories give meaning. So that I think that's a way that we can sort of go to where they are and begin to say, okay, how you want to hear somebody's life story. Okay, we're going to hear one. So here's. I hope anyway that that's a way to engage them. Anybody?
Well, talking about that, I always give my students a hard time because they could identify chapter and verse essentially of things that happened in Harry Potter. And remember which book it happened in, but don't have that literacy for the Bible. But one way I've found around that is, rather than having to be the one to cover all those individual stories, is at some point in the term to give assignments that they are then presenting to the rest of the class. So maybe one student would present on Ruth, another student would present on Joseph, so that they're still getting it and can then put it into the bigger picture. But I'm not having to be the one in front saying, okay, today we're going to talk about Ruth for 20 minutes, and then we're going to talk about David, and and try to fit all that in. And that engages them also in the process of sort of having to interpret it and investigate it themselves.
Good.
Yeah, the strongest tool I found for engaging students is to introduce the idea of midrash.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Let them rewrite the background of the text in a way that makes it meaningful for them. And it produces very strange midrash, but at least they paid attention.
That's right. It might also be a great way to say, and that's what they were doing. They were trying to figure it out. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
It occurs to me, Jerry, that when you say a lot of this is story, and millennials attract the story, one thing people do with stories is argue. And especially in student classrooms, I can hear students just tell their own story to each other without realizing there's actually an argument going on here, and you're disagreeing without saying it. You're just telling your own experience, hoping that communicates everything. That may be a way into talking about biblical story, to say, these people are actually having a fight. Can you tell what the issues are embedded in that?
Mm-hmm.
But it takes that additional skill of figuring out, you do that too all the time.
Yeah.
You think you're just telling a story, you're fighting.
Yeah. Yeah. All right. Other sorts of helpful thoughts for all of us?
I don't know if this is more question or statement, but I can say one reason that I chose this particular book was not for very deep theological reasons. I was very glad to find that they were in there, but it was the layout, the aesthetics of the text. And I wondered if you had anything more that you wanted to say about it. I know at Baylor we have a limited number of texts that we can choose. And the majority of them are close typeset, and they have, if they have pictures, they have, they're black and white. And then I come across this one, and it's, bold, color, wide text, easy to read. And I think sometimes, these other textbooks that I have excellent messages, I really appreciate them, but I don't see my students actually reading them. To the extent that I think we're talking about millennials being more story-driven, but also visually driven. To me, that's been a very helpful experience with this, to actually get them to read these portions, provided I don't make them read like 50 pages. But,
Right.
Was that deliberate? Did that come up in a way? It's pretty unique from what I've seen.
Yeah. It was quite deliberate. Neil can speak to that a good bit. There was a lot of work that went into those designs.
Back to the comment about millennials thinking the three-dimensional world, which I'd like to visit sometime. It occurs to me that's being ironic, because we all live in a three-dimensional world. So to think of biblical texts as two-dimensional, flat, we have to learn the Bible is flat. That's something we have to learn the hard way. And many of our students coming into classrooms don't know that yet. So why go to the extra effort of teaching them to think in 2 dimensions and then sending them back out into a 3-dimensional world? The attempt with this book, this was the first book we tried this with at Fortress, was to specifically go for the kind of visual appearance that students are more used to, either online, although it doesn't move the same way, although it does in ebook format.
Yeah.
But to get the graphic layout that looks more like popular magazines, which is, you don't have to work your way through paragraph after paragraph after paragraph. There is, I tend to think, distraction, but that's not the way many readers think. They think, I need to know, what does this look like? There it is. So this was a very intentional design, and it was alarming to some people at Fortress when we saw the first design and said, that's not a textbook anymore, that's People Magazine. But it really was tested well and came through as an exciting design. I think the second edition now is a little modified from that first edition, but it's still trying for that same visual impact and a much more open design to address that kind of readership.
We spent a lot of time looking through photos and relics and, creating text boxes and doing all sorts of things just to create that feel. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yes, I teach in a majority world context where the majority of students are pretty conservative, and as are the churches. So I don't know if you have any experience with this textbook in those contexts and how it plays.
Well,
And I apologize because I haven't read the textbooks.
okay, it's all right. You teach at Baylor,
I do.
so that's not exactly on the left wing of things. So,
We're more diverse than you might think.
that's right. But you still have to interact with a pretty conservative audience. But I mean, some of the things that I talked about earlier, like being able to ease students into some of those ideas that I think can be presented in ways that are very threatening. I really worked hard to make them be something that can give students space to think their way into a new way of reading. So, yeah.
To match your the illustrations and so forth, I use a lot of material, videos on archaeology. I think you said that you're not the one who said that archaeology is the fifth gospel. And I really take that seriously. But also, they're so visually oriented. If I talk more than 20 minutes, they're gone. They're outside in their head somewhere else. But if I show them Walking the Bible or something from Biblical Archaeological Review or something from Discovery that just popped up on the news, whether it's right or not, that they see something, it's in a place where it's happening in David's city and they're going to move in apartments in there. Now here's what David's city is. All this stuff, I think, really makes a big difference.
Yeah, I think it does. I have a course that I teach where I use a video clip. It's on YouTube of some guy at Qumran. He's excited, you know, and he's doing all that, and he gives them some wrong information. Well, I can correct the wrong information, you know, and I do, but it gets them engaged. It gets them, you know, they're interested. They get to see the site. They get to hear this guy being excited. So I think it's right. Some of those things we can find on YouTube and other places can enhance our classes significantly.
I really appreciate your example of picking our language carefully, so to ease the sense of defensiveness. And I think that's one thing that I'm facing all the time. Like you, a lot of my students come from conservative background, and I have had pushback quite often, very early on, first class, and hands raised. Hey, this is human wisdom.
First Corinthians.
And I would like to hear more about strategies to help not to alienate students. I think sometimes when we hit them too hard with things that they need to learn, but that can be perceived in a very hostile way, and they get all the defensive. I've heard of somebody who preached from the pulpit of his own seminary experience, and he said, from the beginning, I knew that this is like all liberal stuff, and so for every liberal book I read, that the professor have assigned me, I've read the conservative book to just counteract that, right? So I think that person's experience has really misformed him educationally. And how do we, always trying to think, how do we help to not steer people that way, so that they will perceive what they're learning in the classroom as something essentially hostile to their faith, and they have to counteract them somehow. And even if they stay the course, it's very reluctantly. And yeah.
Yeah. Well, I think in context like a seminary, I encounter the same kinds of things. When I was teaching an introduction to the Bible as a seminary class, I would have students, and most of my students were from a liberal background. They would, about the third week, come to me and say, why didn't anybody tell me this in my church? And then about the sixth week, they would come back and say, you don't think I'm going to tell anybody in my church this, do you? So, I mean, I think they've got all kinds of pressures. But I think the central thing with those that that have beliefs they feel are being challenged. And I think the way this book works with the text challenges those that come from more conservative and from more liberal directions, because it asks seriousness about the content of the text. But I think what those people are afraid of is that changing is going to leave them without faith. And I think it's important to say that while this is, in a sense, a challenge to the way they've thought about it, that the real point is to get them to a more credible faith in the world we live in. So that it's an attempt, it will take some things away, but it's going to build something that's stronger, that will make their ministry something that will be able to reach out to people who wouldn't be coming anyway. Right. They'll be able to engage more credibly with their neighbors who aren't where they are. So and in a seminary, I think they have to see you be people of faith. You know, I mean, you have to go to chapel, which is not always where I want to go. You know. But I think for them to have sort of examples of people who know this, who work with it, and don't end up being atheists, you know, or don't end up having nothing, is a really important element. So I try to talk to them about what they get. You know, how reading the way I think, for example, the gospel should be read gives you a much richer and deeper portrait of Jesus than what you get reading the way they do now. It'll be a different one, but it'll be something that informs their faith in a way that makes it a better faith.
We've got about 5 minutes left.
Okay.
5 minutes.
All right. Okay, we got to hurry then. Okay. Now, let me say a couple things about the second edition of the book. We talked about the text boxes. One of the things that were in the text box of the first edition was a bunch of scripture quotations. Now, Fortress did some surveys of people who used the textbook, and a number of them said, we want to get rid of those because we want our students to have to go find the text in the Bible, you know, and read it. So we got rid of a number of those, and we added some things that some of them are questions that then say, go look this up in, you know, Amos. You know, so, or what does Amos think about such and such? And so then they have to go find Amos. You know, so there are things that send them now to the text in ways that didn't happen before. Each chapter also has study questions that appear at the end. They've always had study questions that they're up on, one example's up on the board. Some of those are just mostly content, but one of the other comments about the text is that it would be nice to have some higher order questions. So in a number of chapters there's some higher order questions that ask them to sort of engage how this text is used now, you know, or how some might want to use it in that way. Each chapter also has some suggestions about further reading. So the students, if they're so inclined, can go find more information about that. And one of the things that you'll notice, this has very few, but in some of those that have much long, or not much, but a little bit longer lists, you'll find things that are just one step above the textbook, and then they'll have things that are significantly beyond the textbook. And for those whose field is not biblical studies, some of those that are significantly above what you find in the textbook can be good aids for you as you get ready to teach. As somebody who taught 3 sections of world religions their first semester, I know what it means to be teaching outside your field. You know, so you need some resources to get to quickly, and so some of them serve in that way. And there's also a glossary at the end that helps students with words. I have asked Mark Given, professor of religious studies at Missouri State, to come and talk about his use of the book, actually. He's using it in State University, and he's using it for just a New Testament course. So I'm going to pass out his syllabus to you while he begins to talk.
Well, there's not much time to begin to talk, so
Sorry.
I don't know that anybody has this room after us.
Okay.
So,
We'll go as long as...
yeah, go and sound.
All right.
We're here. Let's see if they can boot us out.
So,
Would you mind standing so we could see you?
You
talk?
sit.
this may be this may be more of a advertisement than anything else. Since most of you are teaching a one-semester intro to the whole Bible, maybe you can just share this around with colleagues who might consider using this text for just New Testament. And I don't know how much detail to go in here about this. But I'm finding, this is the first semester I've tried this, I'm finding that it's working incredibly well. And I'll try to share some reasons why. And it'll overlap with some of the reasons why this is successful generally, this textbook. I do teach in an 18,000 student state university. I typically have about 100 New Testament students each semester, and one of my colleagues does as well. I'm in the buckle of the Bible Belt, Springfield, Missouri, the headquarters of the Assemblies of God. And so, you know, most of my students, I have a good diversity of Christian students, Assemblies, Catholics, Baptists, Methodists, etc. But most of them are conservative, whether they know it or not. I mean, they may not be theologically aware to know that they're conservative, but they are. I face the same issues of biblical illiteracy that Jerry talked about, first of all. And then, this is one of the things I think I can say that doesn't overlap a lot with what Jerry did. The freshmen that I see have a wide variety of college preparedness. And, you know, I have everything from students who can achieve a 4.0 the first semester to ones who are barely going to make it through their first semester. And in the past, I've used Bart Ehrman's Intro to the New Testament. I was one of Bart's first doctoral graduates, and my name's in the book as the acknowledgments because I was a graduate assistant helping him do that. But he's actually become a bit of an issue in itself. Being in such a conservative area, there are students who won't take the class because that's the textbook, which is unfair to Bart. I mean, the content of his intro is not, you know, kind of left-wing radical kind of stuff. But anyway, one of the reasons, though, that I decided to switch to Jerry's intro is that it's written on a much more basic level than Ehrman or Stephen Harris or any of the other New Testament intros that you might choose for my context. And you know, that's helping quite a lot in itself. There's also the cost issues. I mean, I could have switched to Harris or Dulling or something like that, and those cost quite a bit of money. And this is like $45 or so. But, you know, there were other reasons that I wanted to switch to something else. One was that this biblical illiteracy issue means that if I give them an intro to the whole Bible, that I can, you know, spend a week, or as you can see in the syllabus, spend a week or a little bit more on kind of the most important biblical backgrounds there is, and that's the narratives, the stories of the Hebrew Bible. So, and the way Jerry does this is not kind of just dry historical kind of stuff. The historical critical stuff is there, but he is so focused on the biblical story that it fills in the gaps so much better. I have the students read some of the basic stuff about the Deuteronomistic history, so that as we go through the New Testament, that kind of brings things to light that just the things that they resonate with that they wouldn't have understood without that kind of basic background. So it's actually working extremely well as far as I can see. I will say that the intertestamental stuff in this intro is much better than most of the intros to the New Testament that you find. It's fuller, and Jerry talks about the right sorts of things. I joked with him when I first saw this intro to the Bible and said, I can tell you're a New Testament professor. Because the opening chapters that he talked about are important, of course, for any part of the Bible. And then you've got such a nice full section on the last 200 years or so of history before the New Testament period. You know, that there's, I mean, you can justify using this as an intro to the New Testament text because such a huge chunk of it is relevant to the New Testament one way or the other. So I don't want to take any more time on this, but I think this really works well to choose this as a New Testament intro. The concision that he had to use, since it's an intro to the whole Bible, helps me a lot because, again, addressing the biblical illiteracy problem, I want students to read the whole New Testament. If they are using a standard intro to the New Testament, it has so much text in it that how can I require them to read big chunks of the biblical text? So the concision that Jerry had to come up with in doing a whole intro to the Bible helps me teach New Testament. So anyway.
Thanks. Any questions for Mark? One of the reasons that I asked Mark to come and give his testimonial was that I was pleased to hear that it is a text that can be used in that sort of environment. You know, that I know it's a text that gets used in a lot of church-related schools, which I'm very pleased with, and I'm pleased that it has the kind of range that allows for students in different kinds of contexts to hear. As Mark said, everything in here is very concise, and so having a book like this leaves a lot of things to be said, okay, and a lot of things not just to be filled in, but space for you as teachers to have different perspectives as you sort of go through the material, and space for reading the text itself. Since I really focus on sort of those themes, I think that also gives space for you to have students go to very specific texts, so that while I give them a theme, you can go to one story in, Joshua, or one passage in the prophets, or one episode in the Gospels, as not just an exemplification, but also as something that lets you show them how much more there is in this text than just sort of skimming over it the way that we have to do. I'm sorry we didn't get around to it. There are a number of resources on the Fortress Press website that you might be interested in looking at, particularly for perhaps non-Bible people who are teaching Intro to the Bible. So there are little tabs at the bottom of that page down there, some for professors, some for students. And there are videos of me talking about sort of an overview of each of the chapters. There is a syllabus for a one semester introduction to the Bible. There are tests. Sort of the tests are a combination of multiple choice and discussion questions. And there is, under the student tab, a discussion of commentaries, how to use a commentary, and then a list of recommended commentary series by level of difficulty. So that depending on where your students are, what context they're in, whether they're freshmen or whether they're, upper class folks, that you can sort of find and send them to. These are the appropriate kinds of resources to use at this level. Now, all right. We're a little bit past, but thoughts that anyone has before we finish up here?
Can we subcontract and just have you come and teach it?
Basically all there.
All right, well, thank you all.
Thank you.
Thanks for listening to the discussion with Dr. Sumney. To view the show notes for this episode or to leave a comment, head over to fplive.fortresspress.com/020. Fortress Press Live is available via iTunes, SoundCloud, Stitcher Radio, and YouTube. So be sure to subscribe on your favorite podcasting platform. Until next time, this is your host, Sean Tabbitt, signing off.